When I retired, I didn't buy a boat or take off for some tropical island, the way some of my old colleagues did. Pause once. I didn't want all that noise. I wanted something simpler, quiet mornings, fresh air, and a small shed in the backyard where I could read, tinker with wood, and maybe sip some coffee in peace. That was it, my grand retirement plan. The house I chose was perfect, tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac in Emphasis, Maple Hollow Estates, a development known for its neat lawns and friendly neighbors. The backyard had a nice slope, a pair of old oaks, and enough room for the garden shed I'd always dreamed of building. So a month after moving in, I started. It wasn't anything fancy. I measured out a 10x 12-foot area near the back fence, made sure it didn't encroach on the easement, and spent 2 weeks planning the design. I poured the concrete myself, laid the beams, and slowly watched it come to life. Stained cedar walls, a pitched roof, and a screened window to let the summer breeze in. It was peaceful work. Therapeutic even. For a man who spent Emphasis 38 years drafting blueprints and solving other people's problems, it felt good to finally build something for myself. At first, I thought nothing of the occasional glance from passers-by. A few neighbors even waved or nodded as they walked their dogs. No one said a word until she showed up. It was early Tuesday morning when I met her. I was hammering down the frame of the front overhang when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned and found a woman standing just inside the edge of my yard. Blonde bob-pressed blouse clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge. "Mr. Barrett," she asked, squinting at the papers she was holding. "That's me," I said. "I'm Karen Albright, president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association." I wiped my hands on my jeans and nodded politely. "Pleasure." She did not return the pleasantry. "I was informed that you've begun construction on an external structure," she said. I smiled, trying to keep things light. "Just a shed." I checked the city code. It's under the height limit not attached to the house and more than 10 feet from the property line. Karen didn't blink. External structures, regardless of municipal code compliance, must be approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. Per Maple Hollow CCR's Section 5.4.1. I raised an eyebrow. "It's a shed." "A Emphasis structure," she corrected. I nodded slowly. "Right, and if I need to submit something, I'd be happy to. I just didn't see it listed as a restriction." She handed me a packet of paperwork, thick as a phone book. "Your violation notice," she said. I blinked. "Violation for unauthorized construction," she replied flatly, "and failure to submit proper plans for approval." "But I just moved in." "The rules apply to all residents," she said, turning on her heel. I stared at her retreating figure, the papers in my hand still warm from the printer. For a moment, I thought, this can't be real. It's just a shed. But it was real. That night, I skimmed the CCR packet and found the clause she referenced. It was vague, open to interpretation, but enough to give her a foothold. I called the HOA number listed on the sheet the next morning. No answer. Left a voicemail. No reply. Sent an email. Got a boilerplate response. "Your concern has been forwarded to the Architectural Review Committee." No names. No timeline. No actual people. Meanwhile, I kept building. The foundation was done. The walls were up. It was quite honestly beautiful. A little hideaway tucked into the trees. I installed a solar-powered light, some shelving for my bonsai trees, and a small foldable chair I used to read in every morning after sunrise. Then the letters started. The first came certified mail. A $150 fine for non-compliance. The second, just 3 days later, increased the fine to $300 and warned of possible legal escalation. The third wasn't even mailed. It was hand-delivered, slipped under my door, and printed in bold red font. Emphasis, final warning. Structure removal required immediately. I tried reaching out again. No response. I even walked to the HOA office, only to find it was a locked drop box attached to the back of the community center. No receptionist, no office hours, just a form to fill out and a faded sign that is read, "Emphasis. Thank you for keeping Maple Hollow beautiful." Beautiful apparently didn't include my little shed. I called my son that night, Nate Barrett. He's the chief of police in our county, a good man, steady sharp. He'd always been the kind of kid who read the instructions before opening the toy. I trusted him. And more than anything, I needed to talk to someone who would take me seriously. Dad, he said gently. After I explained the whole story, it sounds like you're being harassed. It's a shed, I said again, exhausted. I'm not running a business. I'm not storing anything dangerous. I just wanted a space to be alone with my tools and my books. Do you want me to come over? No, I sighed. I'll figure it out. But something shifted after that call. I noticed a car slowly cruising past my house every evening, always the same silver sedan, always moving just slow enough to look. Sometimes it paused. Once I stepped out onto the porch and it accelerated away. The next morning I found a small printed photo in my mailbox. It was a picture of the shed, taken at night. No return address, no note, just the photo. That's when it became clear this wasn't about the shed. It was about emphasis, control. I started keeping a journal. Recording everything: dates, times, letters received, strange cars, unanswered emails. I even installed a security camera, just in case. Karen returned the following week, flanked by a man she introduced as Gregory, Vice Chair of Enforcement. He didn't speak, just nodded occasionally and took notes. I'm afraid if you don't comply, Karen said, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement. I couldn't help but smile. You're welcome to, I replied. Because what Karen didn't know, and what I wasn't going to tell her just yet, was that the chief of police she planned to call, he was my son, and he was already aware. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, but I hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly or so publicly. 2 days after my last exchange with Karen, I stepped outside to water the azaleas and noticed something taped to the shed's newly varnished door, a neon orange sticker laminated and stamped with the HOA logo in bold black font. Emphasis: stop work. Non-compliant structure. Subject to removal. It looked like something the city would slap on an abandoned building. I pulled it down, heart pounding. It wasn't just offensive, it was humiliating. It meant Karen had trespassed into my backyard, and worse, that she'd done it when I wasn't home. No warning, no notice, no respect. That morning, I emailed the HOA again. No response. I called, straight to voicemail. Then I walked to Karen's house. I knew where she lived, 2 blocks down, with 3 identical hydrangea bushes out front and a plastic flamingo she probably thought was whimsical. Her car, a bright blue Subaru, was parked in the driveway. The HOA placard dangled proudly from the rearview mirror. I rang the bell. She answered a moment later, just as composed as always, lipstick-perfect cardigan draped like a cape. Mr. Barrett, she said, tone flat. To what do I owe the visit? You were on my property, I said, holding up the orange sticker. You put this on my shed. Her eyes darted to it, then back to me. As president of the Homeowners Association, I have the authority to issue stop work orders for structures that violate our community standards. Community standards, I echoed. Even when those standards contradict county code, there are levels of regulation, she said. Ours are stricter for a reason, and trespassing is one of them. She stiffened. You left the gate unlocked. That's implied access. No, I said firmly. It's my backyard, my property. And what you're doing is harassment. She tilted her head. Mr. Barrett, you've been uncooperative since day one. You refused to submit your plans. You ignored formal warnings. You continued construction despite repeated notices. I've tried to be reasonable, but your defiance is forcing our hand. I clenched the paper in my hand. It's a shed. It's a violation, she snapped. And if you don't remove it by Friday, we'll be issuing daily fines and proceeding with legal remedies. I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to raise my voice. You want to call the police over a garden shed? She didn't answer. Just closed the door. I walked home in a daze. That night, I sat in my little workshop unfinished, still smelling of sawdust and cedar, and stared at the walls. My hands rested on the workbench, calloused, steady. But something inside me trembled, not with fear, but with the bitter realization that the life I had hoped for in this neighborhood, this so-called retirement paradise, was being eroded one clipboard at a time. And yet, a deeper part of me had no intention of backing down. The next morning, the fines began. The first was taped to my mailbox, $250. The next day, another $300. By the end of the week, the total had ballooned to nearly 1,500. I kept each letter, filed them in a folder. Then I measured the shed, again height distance from the property line, proximity to easements. Everything was within code. I even called the county zoning office myself and got verbal confirmation that no permit was required for a structure of its size. But none of that mattered to Karen. She didn't operate on facts. She operated on intimidation. She returned that Friday this time, with Gregory in tow again and a new face, a man in a gray suit who identified himself as the HOA's legal advisor. He didn't hand me a business card, just a stern look and a printout listing my continued defiance of governance authority. "This is your final notice," Karen said, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "Comply by Monday, or we escalate this further." That was it. No discussion. They turned and walked away. I didn't follow. I called Nate. He picked up on the first ring. "You okay, Dad?" "No," I said, voice low. "They're threatening to involve law enforcement." He didn't speak right away. "Then, do you want me to intervene? I want you to know what's happening," I said. "Because if they do make that call, I think you should be the one who answers." He sighed. "Okay, I'll be ready." What happened next felt almost surreal. Sunday afternoon, just as I returned from picking up groceries, I saw Karen's Subaru parked out front again. This time, she was standing with two uniformed HOA volunteers gesturing toward the shed. One of them held a measuring tape. The other took pictures. And standing at the curb, arms crossed, was a stranger in a black tactical vest with HOA compliance enforcement stitched across the front. I approached. Karen turned to face me. "You've left us no choice," she said. "We formally reported your non-compliance to local authorities. They'll be arriving shortly." I raised an eyebrow. "You called the police." "I did," she said with unmistakable pride. "You've left us no alternative." Just then, a black SUV turned the corner and rolled to a stop beside the group. The door opened, and out stepped, emphasis, Nate Barrett, wearing his badge, wearing his uniform, and walking calmly toward the group. Karen's smugness faded in real time. She turned, blinked, and said, You must be the responding officer." Nate didn't speak right away. He looked at me, then at the shed, then finally at Karen. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Chief Barrett. You called for law enforcement regarding a structure on this property?" Karen stammered. "Yes, there's an unapproved shed. We've sent multiple notices. The homeowner has ignored our authority." Nate pulled out a small tablet from his cruiser and tapped the screen. "This property is owned by Robert Barrett. The structure in question meets all municipal codes and was confirmed legal by the county office 2 weeks ago." She froze. "And he's my father," he added evenly. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "This is highly irregular," she said. No, Nate replied. "What's irregular is harassing a retired citizen over a structure that harms no one and falls fully within legal limits." Karen's eyes darted to the fake compliance officer, who took a cautious step back. Nate turned to the man. "You are not law enforcement. Remove the vest." The man hesitated. Now Nate repeated. The vest came off. Karen sputtered something about bylaws and committee powers, but Nate cut her off. "This is not a criminal matter, and if I receive one more call from this organization attempting to misuse police resources, we'll open an investigation into harassment and abuse of authority." Then calmly, Nate turned to me. "Nice shed, Dad." I smiled. "Thanks, son." Karen stood there, red-faced and trembling. And for the first time, she had nothing more to say. After Nate's visit, I expected the situation to die down. Any reasonable person would have taken that moment, the police chief himself arriving on behalf of his father and confirming the legality of the structure, as the final chapter in a minor neighborhood dispute. But Karen wasn't reasonable. She was something else entirely, someone who couldn't stand being told no, especially not publicly, and especially not by a man she'd tried to humiliate. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when I noticed a new compliance notice nailed to the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. In large, bold letters, it read, emphasis. Residents are reminded that all exterior structures, regardless of personal connections to law enforcement, are subject to HOA review and disciplinary action. No exceptions. My name wasn't on it, but it didn't have to be. That passive-aggressive little jab was loud and clear. She wasn't backing off. She was digging in. I stood there staring at it, coffee growing cold in my hand. A few neighbors passed by, some nodding awkwardly, others avoiding eye contact altogether. One man, Jim, I think, who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, mumbled sorry about all this and shuffled away. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And now Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was trying to make an example out of me. Later that day, I walked around the perimeter of my backyard and noticed a small black camera screwed into the top of a street lamp directly behind my fence. It was angled just so perfectly aligned to watch the shed, my deck, and most of my back door. I called Nate. "Dad," he said after a pause, "that's illegal. The HOA has no authority to install surveillance equipment without notifying the homeowner, and certainly not aimed at your private property. Want to come take it down?" "Tempting," he said with a chuckle. "But it'll make more of an impact if you file a formal privacy complaint. I'll guide you through it." That night, Amanda Barrett, Nate's wife, and a county prosecutor dropped off the forms herself. She gave me a look like I'd been adopted into the Barrett legal team. "You've got them rattled," she said, sliding the documents across the table. "They're overreaching because they're scared of what I asked." She tilted her head, losing control. And that's when it finally clicked. Karen wasn't fighting me because of the shed. She was fighting me because I didn't fold, because I had the gall to question her authority, and worse, I had backup. But what she didn't know was that the more she pushed, the more I documented. I'd been keeping records since the first warning, every notice, every visit, every fine. Now I began adding photos, timestamps, and witness names. I even bought a body cam, something subtle clipped to my shirt, just in case the next encounter turned hostile. It didn't take long. 3 days later, I came home from the hardware store and found my gate chain shut. A silver lock glinted in the sun, attached to a chain that hadn't been there that morning. There was no note, just the lock. I stared at it, stunned. This was no longer a dispute, it was sabotage. I called Nate again, and this time, he didn't laugh. "That's criminal trespass," he said. "Do not touch the lock. I'm sending a unit." When the officers arrived, they brought bolt cutters, gloves, and clipboards. Karen showed up 20 minutes later, arms crossed, watching from across the street. When the officers cut the chain and confirmed the incident as criminal interference, she stepped forward. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "The HOA has the authority to secure non-compliant structures until board review is completed." "No, ma'am," the officer said, pointing at the printed county code. "Not without a court order, and not on private property." Karen didn't flinch. "We're well within our rights. Then we'll see you in court," the officer replied flatly. She turned and walked away again, slower this time. Like maybe the ground beneath her wasn't as firm as she thought. But the real turning point wasn't the chain. It came the next morning. I received an envelope in the mail, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a printed photo. It showed me sitting in the shed reading a book. The angle was elevated like it had been taken from one of the street cameras. On the back, in block letters, emphasis: rules exist for a reason. I sat down at the kitchen table, gripping the photo. That's when it stopped being funny. That's when I realized it wasn't just about HOA power anymore. This was about emphasis: intimidation. About a woman so desperate to preserve her illusion of control that she was willing to cross any line, break any boundary to make me submit. But what she failed to understand, what Karen had never bothered to learn about me, is that I don't break easily. Not after 2 back surgeries. Not after losing my wife. Not after emphasis: 38 years of holding my tongue in corporate meetings run by egos and politics. And certainly not because of a bully with a clipboard. So I made a decision. I scanned every document, every photo, and every video file. Nate helped me draft a complaint package and submitted it to the county's HOA oversight office. Amanda contacted a journalist she knew who'd covered community abuse cases in the past. And I installed my own cameras, 2 on the front, 2 in the back, 1 inside the shed. If Karen wanted a fight, I was no longer on defense. I was building a case, and she'd already given me everything I needed. Monday morning came with the kind of stillness that makes you hold your breath. There was no HOA letter in the mailbox. No clipboard bearing volunteers at the end of the cul-de-sac. The community bulletin board was blank for the first time in weeks. For a moment, I wondered if things were finally cooling down. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Mr. Barrett, a woman's voice, asked professional but clipped. Yes. This is Officer Ramirez with County Dispatch. We received a call regarding a disturbance at your residence. A representative from your homeowners association has reported ongoing construction in violation of community safety standards. Officers have been dispatched and should be arriving shortly. I closed my eyes. Of course. Thank you, I said as calmly as I could manage. I'll be waiting. I hung up and stood at the back door watching the shed bathed in morning light. It sat quietly beneath the trees, humming with peace with intention. It was just a shed, but to me, it had become something else, a line in the sand, a refusal to shrink under pressure. I called Nate. Dad, he said, answering immediately. She called the police, I said. He paused. Are they on the way? County Dispatch said yes. You working today? I'm 10 minutes out, he said. Don't do anything. Don't even walk outside, just wait. And so I did. I sat at the kitchen table facing the driveway. The coffee in my mug went cold. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I heard the distant sound of tires on asphalt, and moments later a patrol car rolled into view. 2 officers stepped out, one older and one fresh-faced. They approached slowly like they were already wary of what this was about. I opened the door before they knocked. Good morning, I said. Mr. Barrett, the older one asked. That's me. We received a report of unauthorized construction, the younger one began, but the older officer cut him off with a subtle glance. Mind if we take a look, he asked gently. Not at all, I said. It's in the backyard. Been there for nearly a month. As we walked around the house, I noticed another car pulling into the cul-de-sac, a dark gray SUV. My chest eased. Nate. He stepped out in full uniform, this time badge, gleaming pistol at his hip, radio crackling faintly. He looked calm, composed, and entirely in control. Chief Barrett, the older officer, greeted him with a nod. Morning, Nate replied, eyes scanning the scene. Karen was already outside, flanked by Gregory and 2 other HOA board members. She was standing across the street, arms crossed, a familiar folder in her hands. Officers, she called out, striding toward us with feigned authority. This is the property in question. The structure is still standing despite multiple violation notices. The homeowner is in clear breach of Article 5, Section 3.1 of the Community Agreement. Nate didn't look at her. He turned to the officers. Has any law been broken? The older one shook his head. Not that we can tell. It's within zoning code and county regulations. Then this is not a criminal matter, Nate said. Karen's lips thinned. You're recused from this situation. It's a conflict of interest. Nate finally turned to face her. No, ma'am. I'm here because your repeated calls to emergency services over non-criminal matters constitute misuse of public resources. I'm here because this is my jurisdiction, and I'm here because you've crossed a line. Karen flushed, but kept her voice steady. We have a right to enforce our rules. No, Nate said evenly. You have a right to submit civil complaints through proper channels. You do. Emphasis, not have the right to harass residents, install unauthorized surveillance chain gates shut, or call the police for intimidation purposes. Gregory tried to interrupt, but Nate raised a hand. You want to keep playing this game? He asked. Fine, but here's how it's going to go. Every call from the HOA to law enforcement will be reviewed. Every video recorded by Mr. Barrett has been logged and time-stamped. And if I find evidence that this association has used false pretenses to enforce authority it doesn't have, I will initiate a formal investigation through the district attorney's office. Silence. Emphasis. Dead silence. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Karen opened her folder as if to counter with documents, but her fingers trembled just enough that the papers shook. This is about maintaining order, she said, but her voice was thinner now. No, Karen, I said, finally stepping forward. This has always been about control, but I'm not afraid of you, not anymore. She looked between me and Nate, then at the officers who made no move to stop either of us. Then quietly, she turned and walked away. Gregory followed. The two board members hesitated a moment longer, then trailed after them like dogs unsure of who to bark at. Nate turned to me. "You all right?" I nodded. "Better now." "I'll file the report personally," he said. "You should expect fewer interruptions." I chuckled. "And if there are more?" He gave me a look I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, a mix of loyalty and fire. "Then they'll get to know me better than they want to." That evening I sat in my shed, finally alone, finally quiet. The sun filtered through the slats, casting long shadows over my workbench. I ran my fingers over the cedar and smiled. Nate stopped by around dinner time. He brought pizza. We sat out on the porch with slices in hand and silence between us. Not uncomfortable silence, earned silence. "You know," he said, eventually, "she really thought she could scare you. She tried," I admitted. "She almost did. But you stood your ground." "Had to," I said. "I built this shed to find peace. I wasn't about to give it up just because someone thinks a title makes them right." He nodded. "Most people would have just torn it down. Most people don't have a police chief for a son." He smiled, then raised his slice in mock salute. "To peaceful resistance," he said. I raised mine too. 2 sheds. The next few days brought a strange kind of calm. Not peace, no, not yet, but a lull, like the eerie quiet after a storm that hasn't fully passed. The shed still stood undisturbed. The threatening letters stopped. And for the first time in weeks, I was able to sip my coffee on the porch without feeling eyes burning into the back of my neck. But calm can be deceptive. On Thursday, I stepped outside to check the mailbox and found a manila envelope wedged inside, thick-sealed with a sticker that read, "Emphasis, HOA Legal Action Notice," in red ink. My heart sank. I opened it, on the porch, hands already tense. Inside was a 7-page document, carefully formatted and dressed up with legal language, but empty of substance. A formal cease and desist demand alleging that I was in violation of spirit and enforcement, intent of community, aesthetic agreements, and that if I did not comply with full demolition of the shed by the following Monday, the HOA would be forced to pursue immediate injunctive relief. It wasn't signed by a lawyer. It was signed by Karen Albright, typed not even in ink. No firm name, no letterhead. Just Karen still clinging to her fantasy of authority. I laughed not because it was funny, but because it was so wildly pathetic that it almost broke the tension. But then I saw the note stapled to the last page, not typed, handwritten. Emphasis. "You think you're safe because of your son. You won't be forever." That chilled me to the bone. It was the first time she crossed the line from nuisance to veiled threat. I called Nate. He answered immediately. "I need you to see something," I said. "It's not just HOA nonsense anymore." He arrived 20 minutes later, unmarked car, no uniform. Just my son, calm, alert, and increasingly angry as he read through the packet at my kitchen table. "She wrote this?" he asked, flipping to the last page. "Every word." "And this note?" I nodded. "That's her handwriting." He set the papers down slowly. "This isn't about a shed anymore," he said. "It's about power." She's embarrassed, cornered, and now she's lashing out. "Can she actually sue?" I asked. "She can file paperwork," he said. "But any competent judge will throw this out in 30 seconds, especially with your compliance record and the fact that you've followed every city code to the letter." He stood and began pacing the kitchen. "I've been trying not to get directly involved beyond what's appropriate," he said. "Didn't want to be accused of favoritism or conflict of interest. But this crosses a line." He paused, then looked at me. "I think it's time I paid Karen a visit, not as your son, as the police chief." I hesitated. "You sure you want to do that?" He nodded. "It won't be loud. It'll be quiet, professional. But she needs to understand that she's now operating outside the law." That afternoon, he did exactly that. I don't know exactly what was said. He kept the conversation private, professional. But I watched from a distance. As he walked up Karen's driveway, knocked once, and waited. She answered, visibly startled. Nate spoke calmly, firmly, gesturing, occasionally holding a folder in his hands. Karen didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when he handed her the folder, copies of all the letters, the zoning documents, the surveillance photos she never had permission to take, she didn't argue. She just stood there, hands trembling, nodding slowly. 15 minutes later, he walked back toward me. "It's done," he said. "That's it for now." I nodded. She didn't scream at you. She didn't need to. She knew what? That this stopped being about a shed a long time ago, and that she just tried to intimidate the wrong family. The next day, the community bulletin board had a new post. No signature, no logo, just plain paper. Residents are reminded that the HOA board does not have unilateral legal enforcement authority. All compliance concerns must be submitted through formal city channels. We thank you for your cooperation. It was her concession, not an apology, but the closest thing to surrender Karen Albright would ever allow herself. The real confirmation came 2 days later when Gregory stopped me at the mailbox. He looked uncomfortable, like he was chewing something bitter. For what it's worth, he said, eyes on the ground, I never agreed with how far she took things. I didn't reply. She's stepping back for now, he added. We'll be restructuring. Opening board elections. I nodded. That's probably wise. She was scared of you, he said suddenly. Not because of the shed, because you didn't back down. She should have been more scared of what she was becoming, I replied. He looked up, and for the first time I saw it guilt. Then he walked away. That evening, Nate came over with Amanda and the grandkids. We grilled burgers, lit the fire pit, and sat in the backyard, the shed standing proud behind us like a defiant little temple of independence. Nate handed me a small plaque, laser engraved, emphasis, Dad's den where peace was built and protected. I swallowed a lump in my throat. Thanks, son. He smiled. She won't bother you again. I looked out across the yard. The shadows were long, the fire crackling. She can't, I said. Not anymore. Because the truth was, the shed was never the threat. The threat was what the shed represented. Control resisted. Silence broken. And a father, with the quiet strength of age, backed by a son, who had inherited his spine, not just his name. By the following week, something had shifted in the air. Neighbors who used to avoid my gaze now waved as they passed. A couple I hadn't spoken to since moving in stopped during their morning walk to compliment the shed. Even Jim, the quiet one who once whispered sorry as he walked by, paused to ask what stain I'd used on the cedar trim. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like emphasis Maple Hollow, especially when the police chief publicly sets an HOA president back on her heels. But even as the tone shifted outside, I knew Karen wasn't done. Power like hers doesn't dissolve easily. It retreats, regroups. And sure enough, one final strike came not from her directly, but through a passive-aggressive memo slid under every door in the cul-de-sac. Residents are reminded that while legal zoning may permit certain structures, we encourage all homeowners to consider the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood before constructing personal projects. No signature, no letterhead. But we all knew who wrote it, and while it didn't mention me by name, it was the final attempt to shame me into silence. It didn't work. Instead, something else happened. That same evening, I got a knock on the front door. It was Helen and Marcus, a retired couple from 2 houses down. They brought banana bread. We've lived here 15 years, Helen said. And it's never felt quite like a neighborhood. Not until now. I invited them to sit in the backyard. The light was golden, the kind that makes everything look softer. The shed stood quietly behind us. Solid, peaceful, a witness to everything that had unfolded. We talked. Then more neighbors arrived. First Jim, then Mrs. Walters from the corner, then a younger couple I'd only ever seen jogging at sunset. Before I knew it, we had lawn chairs scattered across the grass, paper plates in hand, and stories being shared like we'd all known each other for years. No one brought up Karen. They didn't need to, because in a way, she was why we were all here. Why a group of people who'd once lived side by side, in silence, were now finding common ground. But not everyone was pleased. Around dusk, I noticed a familiar shape lingering near the edge of the cul-de-sac. Karen, standing stiffly by the hydrant across from my yard, arms folded, watching. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Her expression said it all. Betrayal, resentment, confusion. It must have been hard for her to watch this many neighbors smiling gathering on my lawn in front of my shed, the very structure she tried so hard to erase. I met her eyes and smiled. That was the turning point. Because that moment, more than any letter, fine, or threat, was where the power shifted. She wasn't feared anymore. she was pitied. And power built on fear cannot survive pity. The next morning, I received a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No seal, no bold ink, just my name handwritten. Inside was a single sentence. I may have misjudged the situation. K.A. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The community had already responded for me. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board underwent a quiet transformation. Gregory officially resigned. A formal notice was posted calling for open nominations to fill vacant seats. This time, instead of hand-picked allies, every homeowner got a vote. A new neighbor, a school teacher named Nina, was elected chair. She stopped by my house after the first meeting. "I hope we can make this place better," she said. "Less punitive." I offered her a cup of coffee on the porch. "We already have," I said. But perhaps the most satisfying change came from the county itself. After Amanda forwarded the full file, photos, letters, body cam footage, even the cease and desist, with Karen's handwritten threat, the HOA Oversight Commission began auditing Maple Hollow's enforcement history. They discovered years of questionable fines, duplicate charges, and multiple compliance notices issued with no supporting evidence. The county suspended the HOA's fining privileges pending full review. And just like that, Karen's kingdom crumbled. But I didn't celebrate. Not outwardly. I didn't dance or post in the neighborhood forum or gloat to her face. I just built a new bench in the shed, added another shelf for bonsai, and carved a small quote into the back wall. Emphasis. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth. One afternoon, Nate came by with the kids. We sat in the yard watching them play, while Amanda helped them plant sunflowers in a corner of the garden. "You did it," Nate said, smiling. "No," I said. "We did. Quietly. Without shouting. Without burning anything down." "You made a lot of noise with that silence, Dad." I looked around at the yard, the people, the light. Maybe he was right. With the tension settling into something resembling peace, I might have let it go. I could have resumed my quiet retirement, tending to bonsai in the mornings, whittling down pieces of pine wood into shapes no one else needed to understand, and sharing banana bread with Helen and Marcus. But there was something that wouldn't leave me alone. A question. How had she gotten away with it for so long? Karen's reign hadn't just been annoying or overly zealous. It had been strategic, sustained, and oddly precise. She knew just how far to push, just how much fear to sprinkle, and exactly where to strike. And those letters, the formatting, the phrasing, the faux legal vocabulary, they weren't amateur. Something didn't sit right. And when something doesn't sit right, I don't sit either. I began going through the letters again, the ones I'd kept in that old file folder on my bookshelf. I spread them out across the dining table and read each line aloud. Then I compared the fine amounts, the escalation timelines, the language, and that's when I saw the dates. The warning letters didn't just escalate every few days. They escalated on a schedule, every third day, like clockwork, not as a reaction, as a program. I grabbed a ruler, a pen, and a legal pad. I made a timeline. Karen's threats notices and surveillance all followed a calculated rhythm. She wasn't improvising. She was running a system. I called Nate. "This might sound crazy," I said, "but I don't think Karen was doing all this alone." There was a pause. "I'm listening," he said. So I showed him the pattern. I emailed scanned copies of every document and the timeline I built. That night, he came by with Amanda. She wore her work face, calm, exact, and about 2 degrees colder than room temperature. These letters, she said, flipping through them, weren't just written by someone who enjoys making threats. They were likely templated, probably drafted by legal counsel or software. Software, I asked. Some HOAs outsource management to third-party firms, she explained. These firms provide compliance packages, pre-written violation notices, escalating fine schedules, legal-sounding templates. Most are above board. Some aren't. And some, Nate added, have been caught pushing illegal fines, abusing loopholes, or even creating dummy boards to justify their own services. So we dug deeper. Amanda filed a public records request with the county for all documents submitted by the Maple Hollow HOA in the last 5 years. Nate reached out discreetly to contacts in code enforcement and county planning. I went to the library, where they still had a clunky public terminal that could access archived property records. What we found confirmed everything. Karen hadn't been operating as a lone neighbor with too much time on her hands. Maple Hollow HOA had 3 years ago signed a service contract with a private firm named Emphasis Civic Shield Management Solutions, a company that operated under multiple LLCs across 3 states. The contract gave Civic Shield full authority over enforcement letters, violation tracking, and even if challenged, the option to refer unpaid fines to collections. But here's the kicker: that contract had expired 14 months ago. Unrenewed, unfiled, no updated version. Meaning Civic Shield, and by extension, Karen had been issuing enforcement actions, emphasis, without legal authority for over a year. And every fine they collected during that period, illegally obtained. Amanda's eyes narrowed. That's fraud. We weren't done. The documents also showed that Karen herself had co-signed the Civic Shield contract, but not as HOA president. She'd signed as Emphasis managing director of an entity called MHE Advisory Group, LLC. I looked at her signature, then looked at Amanda. What is that? I asked. A conflict of interest, she said. A big one. It meant Karen had been running both sides, the HOA and the vendor, paying herself through a shell company while hiding behind community governance. We prepared a dossier. All the documents, scans, dates, signatures, property records, a side-by-side comparison of HOA income and Civic Shield disbursements, which, thanks to a nosy former treasurer, bless her heart, Mrs. Kelsey, were still accessible via old newsletters. The total overemphasis, $47,000, in questionable fines issued in just under 18 months. Amanda sent the entire package to the county auditor's office and the State Housing Commission. Nate filed a formal complaint through the municipal fraud tip line. We didn't hear back right away, but we didn't need to, because the next week the letter came. It wasn't from Karen. It was from the county. In light of submitted documentation, all Maple Hollow HOA enforcement activities are hereby suspended pending full audit. No further fines may be issued. Previous fines within the audit period are declared non-enforceable. Refund requests may be filed through the county mediation office. The power was gone. The illusion shattered. Karen tried to hold a meeting the next weekend, her last desperate act, but no one came. Gregory resigned again, this time in writing. A formal vote was announced for a new independent resident-led HOA board. Karen's name wasn't even on the ballot, but the part that stuck with me most: the look in Nate's eyes when he read the letter aloud at our kitchen table. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He looked relieved, because we both knew what this had become. Not a fight over a shed, but a test of whether truth backed by courage and patience could still cut through layers of intimidation and bureaucracy. That evening, I sat in my shed pen in hand and added a second quote on the back wall. Emphasis: when the law is used to suppress truth, must be the louder voice. And in that moment, with cedar in the air and silence in the yard, I finally exhaled. We were winning. The county's audit letter wasn't just a victory, it was a floodgate. Within days of the announcement, the silence that had hung like fog over Emphasis Maple Hollow broke wide open. Neighbors who had never spoken above a whisper now stood in driveways, exchanging stories, holding folders, rereading letters they once thought were just their burden to bear. And then came the flyers. Printed on plain white paper, folded neatly, and slipped into every mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting, community center, Saturday at 4 p.m. All optic transition of board authority and resident oversight. No fancy logo. No smug quotes about unity and aesthetics. Just business. And for the first time since this whole ordeal started, I felt something new from this neighborhood momentum. That Saturday, I showed up a few minutes early, unsure of what to expect. I wore a clean button-down not because I wanted to dress up, but because I figured if things were going to change, I wanted to face them head-on with dignity. The community center had never been so full. Rows of folding chairs were filled with more neighbors, standing against the walls, some leaning by the doors. The podium at the front sat empty, a microphone tilted slightly unused. People whispered quietly. Helen waved me over, saving me a seat beside her and Marcus. A few minutes after 4 p.m., Karen arrived, alone. No clipboard, no entourage, no smug smile. She wore beige as always, but the power she once wore like armor was gone. She moved like someone who'd just been told the title on her business card didn't mean what she thought it did. She walked to the podium, cleared her throat, and began. I called this meeting. She started voice softer than I'd ever heard because recent developments have created confusion and disruption in our community. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many of you have received letters, fines, notices over the past 2 years. These actions were taken with the intention of preserving community order. But she hesitated, gripping the edge of the podium. I now recognize that mistakes were made, oversight was insufficient, and certain arrangements that were not disclosed were improper. I tilted my head. Not exactly a confession, but close. Someone in the back muttered, "Just say it." Karen flinched. "I'm stepping down," she said quickly, effective immediately. A beat of silence, then a single clap, then another. And then the room erupted, not in applause of Karen's leadership, but in sheer relief. Applause for closure. Karen stepped back, walked to the side, and sat down near the wall, shrinking into her chair like she was trying to disappear. A man I didn't recognize stepped forward. Late 30s, short beard, glasses. He introduced himself as David Ruiz, a financial consultant who'd moved in last year and had been quietly monitoring the chaos. "I'd like to propose an interim committee," he said, "made up of 5 residents voted in by this room today to oversee operations until we can hold a formal election in 60 days. He paused. Anyone opposed? No hands. The nominations were quick. Nina, the school teacher. Marcus, who once chaired a civic board. David himself. Mrs. Hendricks, the retired librarian. And to my surprise, someone nominated me. I chuckled, shook my head. But then the crowd encouraged it. Not just politely, earnestly. "We've watched you," someone said. "You stood up when no one else did. And so I accepted. I didn't want power, but I believed in stewardship." The vote was a show of hands. No ballots, no bureaucracy, just trust. And for the first time in a long time, Maple Hollow felt like a place where people trusted one another again. Afterward, people stayed. They didn't just scatter like usual. Conversations bloomed. Neighbors who'd once lived in silent fear began asking real questions. How can we change the rules? Can we eliminate the fines? What does transparency really look like? And in the middle of that hum of conversation, I saw Karen get up to leave. She walked past me slowly, head lowered. Then she stopped. "I never expected it to unravel like this," she said quietly. "You thought no one would challenge you," I replied. She nodded. "I thought I was protecting something. You were protecting control," I said gently. "Not community." She didn't argue. She just walked away. That evening, as I sat in my shed with a mug of Earl Grey, I watched the light fade through the small stained glass panel I'd installed the week before. The colors painted the floor like a mosaic, peaceful, earned. Nate called. "How'd it go? Better than I imagined." "You staying on the board for now," I said, "until it doesn't need me anymore." He chuckled. "You always said retirement was about relaxing." I lied. I smiled. "Apparently, it's about fighting HOA corruption." He laughed again, a full proud sound. "Mom would have loved that shed," he said softly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "She's in it every day," I replied. That night before heading to bed, I walked out and added one more line beneath the 2 already carved into the shed's back wall. Emphasis. Sometimes the smallest structures stand against the tallest walls. And this shed, this little place of cedar and calm, had stood taller than I ever imagined. The days following the emergency HOA meeting pulsed with a strange kind of quiet, not the fearful silence that had blanketed Maple Hollow for so long, but something more like a collective holding of breath. The kind that comes right before a storm breaks, or after one passes, when everyone is still trying to assess the damage and decide what to rebuild. Karen's departure from the board, though voluntary in appearance, had shaken the neighborhood's foundation in all the ways that mattered. For years, her leadership had been a monolith, a fixture we'd all resigned ourselves to. Without her, there was a vacuum not just of power, but of purpose. And that was the danger. Vacuum invites chaos just as easily as it invites clarity. So when our new interim chair, Nina, called the first official reform session in her tiny living room, no clubhouse, no podium, just fold-out chairs and a whiteboard. I wasn't sure what to expect. I came early like I always do. Habit from years in the military. Nina had baked cookies. Marcus brought a printed list of the HOA's bylaw amendments from the last 7 years, some of which it turned out had never been properly ratified. Helen, bless her heart, brought color-coded tabs and 2 highlighters, and then the rest began trickling in couples, retirees, young families. Some carried paperwork, others carried tension. A few just came to listen. Nina opened the meeting standing by her kitchen island, not a podium. "We're not just cleaning up a mess," she said. "We're deciding what kind of place this is going to be, for all of us." And just like that, the reform began. The first task was transparency. Marcus explained how fines were historically issued largely by Karen's discretion, sometimes without photographs or timestamps. Gregory, who'd quietly resigned before the fallout, admitted through a prepared letter that many violations had never passed through full board review. What we had wasn't a system, Marcus said. It was a monarchy. Next came a motion to suspend all outstanding fines pending a full audit. It passed unanimously. Then the conversation turned to structural changes. Helen proposed a cap on discretionary enforcement. No one board member could act alone. Everything required vote and documentation. David Ruiz suggested a public-facing HOA portal, where all future warnings, board votes, and financial reports would be visible to residents. A father named Jim asked if we could reassign a portion of HOA funds previously allocated to security monitoring toward building a shaded area at the park for the kids. The answer was yes. Someone even suggested disbanding the HOA altogether. That sparked a long, complex discussion and full of valid fears and hopeful hypotheticals. But in the end, the room came to a quiet, shared agreement. The problem wasn't the HOA. It was who had been allowed to weaponize it. "We don't need to tear it all down," Nina said. "We just need to tear down the parts that made people afraid to plant flowers or build a shed." I nodded quietly, because I had lived that truth. We broke into smaller groups after that, writing, editing, sketching new processes onto legal pads and poster boards like a band of tired revolutionaries drafting a better constitution with colored pens and soft cookies. Later that evening, after the last chair was folded and the last dish cleared, Nina pulled me aside on the porch. "You said something at the meeting last week," she said, "about not wanting power, just stewardship." I nodded. "I think that's why people trust you," she said, "because you're not trying to lead. You're just showing up." "I've always believed the best leaders are the ones who never wanted the job," I said. She smiled. "Then it's a good thing we've got a few of those now." As I walked home, the neighborhood felt changed, not because it was brighter or quieter or newer, but because it finally felt like emphasis ours. We had faced a storm, and instead of breaking, we'd bent, rearranged, and begun the slow process of blooming again. The next week, the first reform package was voted in, officially dissolving the previous fine structure, instituting a rotating oversight committee, and limiting the board president's authority with a strict 2-year term limit. The vote passed 62-2. Karen didn't show, but we didn't need her to. Her shadow no longer loomed over Maple Hollow. And the new light that took its place, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't immediate. It was quiet, honest, human. That weekend, I took down the notice of violation still taped to my garage wall. The one Karen had nailed up months ago. I didn't tear it, didn't crumple it, just folded it neatly and slipped it into the back of an old shoebox. Not out of sentimentality, but out of respect for what it had ignited. Because that piece of paper, that laughable, arrogant scrap of HOA bravado, it started something I hadn't realized we needed. A reckoning, a remembering, and a rebuilding. The week after the reforms were passed, my mailbox became something else entirely. No longer the graveyard of fines, warnings, or unwanted newsletters. It began collecting something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind, the kind you fold by hand, scrawl in pen, and deliver without fanfare. The first envelope came from Mrs. Walters. No return address, just my name on the front in gentle cursive. Emphasis. Thank you for showing us we weren't powerless. For a long time, I thought fear was just the cost of living in this neighborhood. Turns out it was just a tax we paid to someone who never earned our trust. Then came another from the Parker family, the ones whose swing set had been dismantled by HOA order 2 years ago. We're rebuilding the swing set this weekend. Come by if you'd like a hot dog and a victory laugh. Our kids can't stop talking about how that guy with the shed saved their yard. There was one from David Ruiz's teenage daughter, handwritten on notebook paper. My dad's never smiled at a neighborhood meeting before. He came home humming last Sunday. I think you did something big. Thank you. Every letter, every note was a small confirmation that the walls were falling, not the wooden fences or bylaws, but the invisible ones between us. Amanda read them beside me on the porch swing one evening. She didn't say much, just rested her head on my shoulder as the breeze carried the scent of someone grilling down the street. You changed everything, she murmured. No, I replied. We all did. One person just had to start. In the days that followed, more changes came not from the boardroom, but from backyards and porches. The Parker swing set stood tall again, painted in bright red and yellow. Jim, the quiet dad down the road, built a little free library by the walking trail and filled it with fantasy books and gardening guides. Helen organized a flower pot painting day for the kids, complete with snacks and music. I donated extra brushes and a bucket of leftover shed paint. We didn't ask permission from the HOA. We didn't need to, because the HOA now, emphasis, was us. And perhaps nothing proved that more than emphasis, the shed gathering. It wasn't officially planned. It began as a joke on the new neighborhood bulletin board, thinking of starting a shed tour. Mine has snacks. To my surprise, people came. They brought folding chairs, cider, folding tables, even a fire pit. Someone set up string lights. Someone else brought a guitar. The entire backyard glowed with warmth, not from lights, but from presence, from the feeling of being part of something bigger than survival. I opened the shed, swept the floor, and set out my old army coffee can filled with pens and scrap wood. On the back wall, people started writing messages in pencil. At first, I resisted. Then I realized it wasn't mine to protect anymore. It was emphasis ours. Messages bloomed like wildflowers. This neighborhood has roots now. Fear doesn't live here anymore. Thank you for giving us the first yes. Karen Hoob. Toward the end of the evening, Nate arrived with his kids. They ran to hug Amanda, and one of them handed me a hand-drawn picture of the shed with sparkles and a rainbow on top. I heard it's magic, the little girl said. I laughed. Only if you believe in second chances, I said. Nate and I stood at the edge of the yard, later watching neighbors laugh and eat and sing badly off-key around a fire pit someone named the Reclamation Ring. You know, he said, I used to think your stubbornness was just your way. It was, I admitted, until I realized it could be useful. He raised his cup. Too useful stubbornness, then. We clinked plastic cups, and as the evening settled into low laughter and slow songs, I felt something lift, not from my chest, but from the soil beneath all of us. A weight had been released, and in its place, community. Sometime near midnight, as the crowd thinned and Amanda gathered the last paper plates, I sat on the shed's threshold, watching the glow fade from the sky. Nate's daughter returned and asked if she could write one more thing on the wall. I handed her a pencil. She climbed up onto the workbench and wrote in large, shaky letters, emphasis. Sometimes the smallest sheds hold the biggest truths. She looked at me and grinned. I nodded. That night, long after everyone had gone and the stars blinked wide in the sky, I walked the yard one last time. There were chairs still out, footprints in the grass, and laughter still echoing in the silence. And when I turned back to look at the shed, its wood warm from the day, its windows softly reflecting the moon, I saw not a structure, but a story. A monument to something we built together. Out of defiance, out of kindness, out of one man's stubborn refusal to be quiet any longer. And for the first time since the battle began, I slept soundly. Not because I'd won, but because emphasis we all had.